going to finish reading the International Professional Practices Framework for the Institute of Internal Auditors. This is the 2017 version. And we left off in the performance standards, which is 2200 series engagement planning. Internal auditors must develop and document a plan for each engagement, including the engagement's objectives, scope, timing, and resource allocations. The plan must consider the organization's strategies, objectives, and risks relevant to the engagement. Standard 2201, Planning Considerations. In planning the engagement, internal auditors must consider the strategies and objectives of the activity being reviewed and the means by which the activity controls its performance. The second area that internal auditors must consider is the significant risks to the activity's objectives, resources, and operations, and the means by which the potential impact of risk is kept to an acceptable level. Third, internal auditors must consider the adequacy and effectiveness of the activity's governance, risk management, and control processes compared to a relevant framework or model. And fourth, the opportunities for making significant improvements to the activity's governance, risk management, and control processes. Within the 2201 planning considerations, we see A1, which relates to assurance engagements. When planning an engagement for parties outside the organization, internal auditors must establish a written understanding with them about objective scope, respective responsibilities, and other expectations, including restrictions on distribution of the results of the engagement and access to engagement records. The same relating to consulting engagements. Standard 2201.C1, internal auditors must establish an understanding with consulting engagement clients about objective scope, respective responsibilities, and other client expectations. For significant engagements, this understanding must be documented. 2210 Engagement Objectives. Objectives must be established for each engagement. In 2210.A1, actually all of A1, A2, and A3 relate to assurance engagements. Internal auditors must conduct a preliminary assessment of risks relevant to the activity under review. Engagement objectives must relate the results of this assessment. Now this standard is called engagement objectives. So engagement objectives must reflect the results of this assessment of risks relevant to the activity under review. Now A2, internal auditors must consider the probability of significant errors, fraud, non-compliance, and other exposures when developing the engagement objectives. 2210.A3, adequate criteria are needed to evaluate governance, risk management, and controls. Internal auditors must ascertain the extent to which management and or the board has established adequate criteria to determine whether objectives and goals have been accomplished. If adequate, internal auditors must use such criteria in their evaluation. If inadequate, internal auditors must identify appropriate evaluation criteria through discussion with management and or the board. Interpretation. Types of criteria may include internal, external, and leading practices. Internal is the policies and procedures of the organization. External is laws and regulations imposed by statutory bodies. And leading practices is industry and professional guidance and frameworks. 2210.C1 and C2 now follow. Consulting engagement objectives must address governance, risk management, and control processes to the extent agreed upon by the client. And consulting engagement objectives must be consistent with the organization's values, strategies, and objectives. Performance standard 2220 engagement scope. The engagement scope must be sufficient to achieve the objectives of the engagement. In 2220.A1, the scope of an assurance engagement must include consideration of relevant systems, records, personnel, and physical properties, including those under the control of third parties. In A2, we read, if significant consulting opportunities arise during an assurance engagement, A specific written understanding as to the objective, scope, respective responsibilities, and other expectations should be reached, and the results of the consulting engagement communicated in accordance with consulting standards. For 2220.C1, in performing consulting engagements, internal auditors must ensure that the scope of the engagements is sufficient to address the agreed upon objectives. If internal auditors develop reservations about the scope during the engagement, these reservations must be discussed with the client to determine whether to continue with the engagement. 2220.C2, during consulting engagements, internal auditors must address controls consistent with the engagement's objectives and be alert to significant control issues. 2230, Professional Standard 2230, Engagement Resource Allocation. Internal auditors must determine appropriate and sufficient resources to achieve engagement objectives based on an evaluation of the nature and complexity of each engagement, time constraints, and available resources. Interpretation. Appropriate refers to the mix of knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform the engagement. Sufficient refers to the quantity of resources needed to accomplish the engagement with due professional care. Performance Standard 2240, Engagement Work Program. Internal auditors must develop and document work programs that achieve the engagement objectives. In 2240.A1, work programs must include the procedures for identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and documenting information during the engagement. The work program must be approved prior to its implementation and any adjustments approved promptly. 2240.C1, work programs for consulting engagements may vary in form and content depending upon the nature of the engagement. 2300, Standard 2300, performing the engagement. Internal auditors must identify, analyze, evaluate, and document sufficient information to achieve the engagement's objectives. Performance Standard 2310, identifying information. Internal auditors must identify sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information to achieve the engagement's objectives. Interpretation. Sufficient information is factual, adequate, and convincing so that a prudent, informed person would reach the same conclusions as the auditor. Reliable information is the best attainable information through the use of appropriate engagement techniques. Relevant information supports engagement observations and recommendations and is consistent with the objectives for the engagement. Useful information helps the organization meet its goals. Performance Standard 2320, Analysis and Evaluation. Internal auditors must base conclusions and engagement results on appropriate analyses and evaluations. Performance Standard 2330, Documenting Information. Internal auditors must document sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information to support the engagement results and conclusions. In subpart 2330.A1, we read the chief audit executive must control access to engagement records. The chief audit executive must obtain the approval of senior management and or legal counsel prior to releasing such records to external parties as appropriate. 2330.82, the chief audit executive must, we scroll too far, develop retention requirements for engagement records, regardless of the medium in which each record is stored. These retention requirements must be consistent with the organization's guidelines and any pertinent regulatory or other requirements. And 2330.C1, the chief audit executive must develop policies governing the custody and retention of consulting engagement records as well as their release to internal and external parties. These policies must be consistent with the organization's guidelines and any pertinent regulatory or other requirements. 2340, Engagement Supervision. Engagements must be properly supervised to ensure objectives are achieved, quality is assured, and staff is developed. Interpretation. The extent of supervision required will depend on the proficiency and experience of internal auditors and the complexity of the engagement. The chief audit executive has overall responsibility for supervising the engagement, whether performed by or for the internal audit activity. but may designate appropriately experienced members of the internal audit activity to perform the review. Appropriate evidence of supervision is documented and retained. Performance Standard 2400, communicating results. Internal auditors must communicate the results of engagements. 2410, criteria for communicating. Communications must include the engagement's objectives and scope, as well as applicable conclusions, recommendations, and action plans. 2410.A1, final communication of engagement results must, where appropriate, contain the internal auditor's opinion and/or conclusions. When issued, an opinion or conclusion must take account of the expectations of senior management, the board, and other stakeholders, and must be supported by sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. Interpretation. Opinions at the engagement level may be ratings, conclusions, or other descriptions of the results. Such an engagement may be in relation to controls around a specific process, risk, or business unit. The formulation of such opinions requires consideration of the engagement results and their significance. I can say that again. 2410.A2, internal auditors are encouraged to acknowledge satisfactory performance in engagement communications. And 2410.A3, when releasing engagement results to parties outside the organization. That one just didn't sound right. So, address positives and not just negatives. 2410.A3, when releasing engagement results to parties outside the organization, the communication must include limitations on distribution and use of the results. 2410.C1, communication of the progress and results of consulting engagements will vary in form and content depending upon the nature of the engagement and the needs of the client. Performance Standard 2420, quality of communications. Communications must be accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. So these are your standards. Several standards. Accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. You'll learn more. Interpretation. Accurate communications are free from errors and distortions and are faithful to the underlying facts. Objective communications are fair, impartial, and unbiased and are the result of a fair-minded and balanced assessment of all relevant facts and circumstances. Clear communications are easily understood and logical, avoiding unnecessary technical language and providing all significant and relevant information. Concise communications are to the point and avoid unnecessary elaboration, superfluous detail, redundancy, and wordiness. Constructive communications are helpful to the engagement client and to organizations, which lead to improvements where needed. Complete communications lack nothing that is essential to the target audience and lack nothing that is essential to the target audience and include all significant and relevant information and observations to support recommendations and conclusions. Timely communications are opportune and expedient depending on the significance of the issue, allowing management to take appropriate corrective action. Errors and omissions. If a final communication contains a significant error or omission, the Chief Audit Executive must communicate corrected information to all parties who receive the original communication. 2430, use of conducted to the conformance with the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, indicating that engagements are conducted in conformance with the ippf, the international standards for the professional practices of internal auditing, is appropriate only if supported by the results of the quality assurance and improvement program. Performance Standard 2431, engagement disclosure of non-conformance. When non-conformance with the Code of Ethics or the standards impacts a specific engagement, communication of the results must disclose the 1, 2, and 3, 1 principle or rule of the conduct of Code of Ethics or standards with which full conformance was not achieved. 2, reasons for the nonconformance, and 3, impact of nonconformance on the engagement and the communicated engagement results. Standard 2440, disseminating results. The chief audit executive must communicate results to the appropriate parties. Interpretation. The chief audit executive is responsible for reviewing and improving the final engagement communication before issuance and for deciding to whom and how it will be disseminated. When the chief audit executive delegates these duties, he or she retains overall responsibility. 2440.A1. The chief audit executive is responsible for communicating the final results to parties who can ensure that the results are given due consideration. 2440.A2. If not otherwise mandated by legal, statutory, or regulatory requirements, prior to releasing results to parties outside the organization, the chief audit executive must 1, 2, and 3. 1. Assess the potential risks of the organization. 2. Consult with senior management and or legal counsel as appropriate. And 3. Control dissemination by restricting the use of the results. 2440.C1. The chief audit executive is responsible for communicating the final results of consulting engagements to clients. 2440.C2. During consulting engagements, governance, risk management, and control issues may be identified. Whenever these issues are significant to the organization, they must be communicated to senior management and the board. 2450. Overall opinions. When an overall opinion is issued, it must take into account the strategies, objectives, and risks of the organization and the expectations of senior management by sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. This is Professional Standard 2450. The interpretation thereof. The communication will include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 1. The scope, including the time period to which the opinion pertains. 2. Scope limitations. 3. Consideration of all related projects, including the relevance on other assurance providers. 4. Like, say, a concurrent review. 4. A summary of the information that supports the opinion. 5. The risk or control framework or other criteria used as a basis for the overall opinion. Sometimes it says basic as a rule or regulation. Sometimes it's complex, like the cybersecurity assessment tool. And last, the overall opinion, judgment, or conclusion reached needs to be part of that final communication. The reasons for an unfavorable overall opinion must be stated also. I want to say that would result in an unqualified opinion, but I'd have to look at the glossary to make sure that I'm speaking in terms. Performance Standard 2500, monitoring progress. The chief audit executive must establish and maintain a system to monitor the disposition of results communicated to management. 2500.A1, the chief audit executive must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions have been effectively implemented or that senior management has accepted the risk of not taking action. 2500C1. The internal audit activity must monitor the disposition of results of consulting engagements to the extent agreed upon with the client. So that follow-up process is key. And often third-party audit practices are not effectively conducting the follow-up part of their engagement. Performance Standard 2600, communicating the acceptance of risks. When the chief audit executive concludes that management has accepted a level of risk that may be unacceptable to the organization, the chief audit executive must discuss the matter with senior management. If the chief audit executive determines that the matter has not been resolved, the chief audit executive must communicate the matter to the board. Interpretation. The identification of risk accepted by management may be observed through an assurance or consulting engagement, monitoring progress on actions taken by management as a result of prior engagements, or other means. It is not the responsibility of the chief audit executive to resolve the risk. And that is everything for the ippf. So to review, International Professional Practice Framework of the Institute of Internal Auditors, mandatory elements include the Code of Ethics, the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing, the definition of internal auditing, and the standards, which I just read, the attribute standards first, and then most recently the latter half of the performance standards. There is a red book that